by a series of military interventions designed to replace nationalist leaders there with U.S. puppets. So therefore, in 1953, of course, they overthrew the democratic elected Mossadegh government in Iran, which, remember, it had the audacity to nationalize its own oil reserves. As a consequence, by 1967, by the way, U.S. companies had increased their control of Middle East oil reserves from 10%, which is what it had been before the war, to nearly 60%, while England's control, which had been 70%, declined to 30%. In this regard, it's well to remember that the Middle East, of course, contains 65% of the world's oil resources and provides 25% of oil imports into the U.S. Indeed, Iran's own oil reserves are as high as 200 billion barrels, enough to meet the needs of the United States for the next 100 years. And I've wondered, maybe that's why John McCain says we could be there for another 100 years. I guess he's willing to leave once the oil runs out. In short, it's not just because either Britain or the United States gave a damn about the Jewish people that they supported the establishment of an Israeli state in Palestine. All they cared about was establishing an anti-Arab, pro-West nation in the Middle East to be used as a proxy as they carried on that fight, successful so far, for Middle East oil. And as I've already pointed out, the U.S. and not Britain won that struggle between those two nations. And to this day, Israel plays the same role in the imperialist plans of the United States as it did on that day 60 years ago when it was created and hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people were expelled from their own homeland. So it doesn't want to see the Palestinians have a viable homeland today any more than it did in 1948. Let me now address a few other high-profile issues in this Palestinian struggle for return and statehood. First, the issue of terror. Frankly, I'm always amazed at the chutzpah of the Israeli government when it says it must do what it does because of the acts of terror coming from the Palestinians. Now we would all wish for a world where no one wages war and where no one engages in acts of terror, especially against a civilian population. But what is one to do when they have few guns, no air force, no navy, no tanks, as does the power that is illegally occupying them and raining bombs down on their heads and bulldozing away their homes and schools? In this regard, I'm always reminded of that amazing scene, a true fact in history from the Battle of Algiers. Maybe you remember it. The press was interviewing the main general in charge of the Algerian liberation forces trying to get the French out of Algeria. And the indignant West press was saying to him, "Commander, how can you justify the fact that women with baskets who are going in to clean the homes of the French take bombs into the French quarter with those baskets? How can you justify that?" And his answer is something I'll always remember. He replied, "Well, if the French generals will loan us the use of their bomb-dropping airplanes, we will loan them the use of our women with their baskets." His point was simply that you could not compare the violence and criminality flowing from the acts of state terrorism committed by the French with the individual acts of those resisting that criminal occupation. And the same can be said with regards to who are the real terrorists today in the conflict between Israel and the occupied Palestinian people. You simply cannot expect the Palestinians, who have been so long illegally and brutally occupied, to quote unquote fight fair against Israel with its mighty military prowess, its acts of state terrorism, and its billions of dollars of military support from the United States. Then, of course, we should also address the issue of one state, two state. Interesting to see that that issue, which hadn't been on the agenda, even now gets discussed on CNN occasionally. Not, of course, from a particularly balanced point of view, but it is being discussed. I will tell you, there was a time some years ago when the two-state solution made some sense to me. Today it does not. Now, I must say this. The matter of one state or two states is a matter properly decided only by the Palestinian people. They're the people whose homeland has been so brutally occupied for so many years. It's not for me to say what path to sovereignty they should take. But I will say this. Given the realities on the ground after the passage of so much time, given the total balkanization of the occupied territories due to the ever-expanding Jewish settlements in the territories, I just don't see how a separate, viable Palestinian state can now be created in what is left of the occupied territories. It's a bit like saying, well, we started with a whole birthday cake and we already ate most of it, but we want you to have your own cake, so here are the remaining crumbs, do what you will with them. In short, it's way too late to talk about a two-state solution if the solution is to be fair and reasonable and workable, if it is to leave the Palestinians with a viable, livable nation-state. And furthermore, let me just add that I think as a matter of principle, at least from my principles, the world's peoples should always be supporting multi-ethnic, multi-religious, secular states and not single-ethnic, theocratic states. So what would seem to be the only fair and practical solution is a one-state solution where Jews and Palestinians and other present-day residents of Israel can live as equals. But as I say, that is a matter left for the Palestinian people to decide. Let me now touch on another issue that must sadly always be addressed when talking about Israel and Palestine. And that is the issue of critics of Israel, so often and so quickly following their criticism, being labeled anti-Semitic, or if the critic is Jewish, of being labeled a self-hating Jew. You've had a lot of experience with that here on this campus at UC Irvine, I know that. In fact, I thought it was interesting. Some of our Jewish sisters and brothers have a tent up over there, and if you're a student walking this way, past that tent, there's a big sign that says, "Beware, hate speech zone ahead." Now, mind you, they haven't heard yet what anybody's going to say, but since they know it's going to be critical of Israel, it's got to be hate speech. Now, this issue is particularly appropriate to discuss today, given the fact that we meet today on a college campus where, as I say, charges of anti-Semitism have been thrown about widely and frequently. If it's any consolation to you, UC Irvine is not really unique in this regard. Indeed, hardly a day goes by now that we don't hear of yet another college professor being accused of anti-Semitism simply because the professor dared to criticize Israel or invited somebody like me to campus to do the same. And in an age when the entire U.S. Congress has deferred to the Israeli lobby by, among other matters, refusing to demand Bush even consult with them before attacking Iran, this is no small matter. A recent issue of the American Association of University Professors publication, Academ, I guess it is, excuse me, features a list of first-person accounts of those who have been censored or labeled anti-Semitic for daring to criticize Israel or Zionism. For example, at Brown University, the campus Hillel rabbi encouraged students to disrupt and secretly record a public forum on the Middle East being organized by two Brown professors. And the rabbi also subjected those professors to ad hominem attacks of anti-Semitism. Happily, a few days later, after this came to light, she had to resign. And it should be noted that many of the Hillel students supported the forum taking place. At the University of Montana, history chair Richard Drake writes that simply inviting an anti-Israeli lobby speaker to campus can now constitute an extraordinary act of courage. For his troubles, Professor Drake had to face a well-organized campaign to have him dismissed from Brown. Drake notes, and I quote, in the 20 years that I have coordinated this lecture series, I have invited more than 200 speakers to the campus. This invited speaker was the first one to be welcomed with a preemptive barrage of defamatory invective from faculty members, close quote. Brandeis University History Department Chair Paul Jankowski writes about an exhibit of Palestinian children's art that was removed from campus after protests from pro-Israeli supporters. And Bishop Tudu has been barred from speaking at a college in Minnesota because of his criticism of Israel. Further, an op-ed piece published in the Harvard Crimson by Professor J. Loran Matori reports that Harvard's professor of Jewish literature defends such censorship, claiming that, and I quote, anti-Zionism is the worst kind of anti-Semitism, and it is tantamount to an endorsement of the Holocaust. Well, I'm not shy about saying that I'm a fierce critic of Israel and of Zionism, and I'm every bit as quick to decry the Holocaust. Of course,